Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. My name is Rebecca Markert and I'm the legal director for FFRF. Today we'll be discussing religion in public schools, specifically prayer at football games. Every fall, FFRF receives complaints about prayer over loudspeakers at Friday night games and coaches leading their teams in prayer or other forms of proselytizing in public school athletic programs. Today I'm joined with two of our attorneys, Patrick Elliott, who's our senior counsel, and Chris Line, who is Patrick O'Reilly's legal fellow. We're going to discuss religion and football programs around the country, and we're going to highlight timely complaints from this season. As always, if you have a question, you can ask below on our Facebook page, or you can email us at askanatheist@ffrf.org. So Patrick, you and I have been here for a very long time. We've experienced a lot of football seasons with FFRF. I want you to explain to us a little bit about the situation, the state of the law with prayer and football programs.
Right. Well, although it may not be a popular belief, the same law that applies to football programs is what applies to any general school complaint. So public schools can't advance or endorse religion, and the Supreme Court has already weighed in on this on a number of cases, but the two that we often most talk about in this context are one case, Lee versus Weissman, where prayer at an after-school event, a public school graduation, was ruled unconstitutional. And the second one does relate to football. This case is, I think, Doe versus Santa Fe Independent School District in 2000, when the Supreme Court ruled that prayers over the school's public address system were unconstitutional. And so that's kind of the context for prayer that we deal with in football programs. Really, the schools can't have prayer over the public address system. Coaches or other school staff members can't be leading, directing, or participating in prayers either.
Okay, so explain to me, though, why this is problematic at a football game. You know, people aren't required to go to these football games. Why is it still considered a school-sponsored event?
Right, well, anytime there's a school staff member, whether it was in the classroom or in some other context, teachers or staff can't be promoting religion to their students. Parents certainly would be upset if their math teacher was reciting prayers before math lessons. The same thing holds true for students who have the right to participate in extracurricular activities without the religion of an adult, the coach who happens to be leading the program, imposing prayer on the team, encouraging prayer anyway. It'd be the same thing if a coach was telling kids, oh, you shouldn't believe in God. Obviously, parents would be upset about that and would raise complaints. Here, everybody, regardless of their religion, has the right to participate in the school activity, and so they can't include religion in that. And that's a baseline rule for all school activities. It just so happens football is where it comes up often for us.
Right, so we do get complaints about religion in the public schools generally, and most often in athletic programs we have gotten complaints about prayer at basketball games and tennis matches and soccer games. Why do you think football is so special? I mean, that's where we get the most complaints.
Right. I mean, we joke about this a little bit, which is that, rarely are we getting complaints. I've been here over 7.5 years. Rarely am I getting complaints about the school's basketball coach, the tennis coach, the track and field coach. This is a football problem. This is across the country, no matter if it's in the north or the south. We're getting complaints about football coaches imposing prayers on their team, having prayers before the games, either in the locker room or on the field or after the game. Why that is, I don't really know. I think one thing that happens that we've seen in some contexts, which is, a coach at either a college or professional level start this, and it basically trickles down as new people come up in the programs. It's just something that's done, kind of like it's taken a number of years to work out prayers at school graduations. The schools are just doing what they've been doing for a period of time, and so it may be that coaches coming up in these programs are just accustomed to this. But thankfully, it's not going on in a lot of the other sports. It is troubling that it is such a football-specific issue, and school districts have to do their due diligence and make sure that their coaches aren't imposing prayers on their teams.
So let's talk about coaches for a little bit, because we tend to get two complaints. One, where there's prayer over the loudspeaker at games, and then two, coaches who are proselytizing with their teams. We've had complaints about coaches who are leading the team in prayer or asking a student to lead the team in prayer, baptizing their players, and inviting them to church events and things like that. So what are the rights of a public school coach with regards to their own personal religion and their interactions with their team?
Well, there have been some cases challenging this, and usually it comes up in the context where a public school does the right thing and says, no, you can't participate or lead your team in prayer before the game, or do have a chaplain, or those types of violations that we see. And the coaches, in fact, turn around and sue and say, no, I have a free speech right or free exercise right to engage in this activity. And basically across the board, the courts have found that as this is a school event, the school as the employer can say, no, while you're acting in your official capacity as coach, you can't engage in religious practices with your team. A much different issue would be, whether a coach privately were to step aside and pray by themselves is one thing. That's not what we're hearing about. We're hearing about the very public and on-field prayers, basically instituted for other people to observe and to get their teams to engage in. So really, schools have a lot of authority to control how their employees are acting, including, right before or after a game. And I think, for the most part, we're not dealing with anything where there's actually a threat to any coach's rights. Outside of their football program, coaches have wide rights to engage in any religious practices that they may want. Obviously, they may host Bible studies and do things on their own time, but not as part of a school event or school football program.
Sure. So what if the team players themselves decide to do a prayer circle either in the locker room or midfield after the game? Is that okay, and what can coaches do about that?
Right. We think that's certainly something that would be permissible. Students have the right to engage in that type of activity. Again, presuming it's something done on their own and is not just a carrying on of something that's been decided for them for a number of years. So students can choose to pray before or after games, again, presuming that it's a time when they're not supposed to be somewhere else, whether in the locker room or doing something else on the field. They can do that. The one problem we do see sometimes is coaches want to be a part of that. And just as we'd say to the school teachers, if your students are engaging in religious activity, that's something they have to do on their own. That's not for adults, including coaches, to also participate in. So one issue is coaches shouldn't be participating in that. It has to be bona fide, student-initiated and student-led religious practice, whatever that may be, if it's prayer or something else.
Right. So what about the situation, which we seem to see a lot of too, is they'll have prayer over the loudspeaker before the games as part of their opening ceremonies. We write a letter to them and tell them that that's inappropriate. So sometimes the solution is, well, let's just invite a student to come up and give the prayer. Is that okay?
Well, this is still a problem. I mean, as you know, this is a thing that we deal with all the time. Is the school's first answer or question after getting a letter from us isn't, well, how do we comply with the law? It's how do we get around this? And so they're trying to do exactly what happened in the Santa Fe case that the Supreme Court ruled on. Is the school district worked out a scheme so that students could vote on whether a prayer would be delivered prior to the school football games. The Supreme Court said, well, this is still a school event on school property. Teams are wearing school uniforms. Using the public address system for this, is unconstitutional. So it really is a problem for schools to come up with some what they think is a workaround, but really is still a school-imposed or school-endorsed religious practice. Using the PA system for that type of thing would still be problematic.
Okay. So as I mentioned, FFRF receives a lot of complaints about religion in the public schools, particularly in the fall. It's our busiest time of year. And over half the complaints we receive yearly involve religion in the public schools. I just want to read a couple of statistics for everyone. Last year, we sent over 20 letters to school districts about prayer at athletic events, so prayer over loudspeakers, and 35 letters to districts about coaches who are proselytizing their team. This year, we're pretty much on track for those same statistics. We've already sent over 20 letters about prayer at athletic events and over 30 to districts about coaches who are praying with their team, leading their team in prayer or proselytizing in some way. And we still have about 15 that are still pending review by our attorneys. That is going to wind down now that football season is over. I think that all of the attorneys here at FFRF have that one case that they remember was their first school football prayer case. Mine was Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, where it was prayer over the loudspeaker. I'm sure you also have that. But I want to turn to Chris and talk about some of the cases that you've been working on this fall, because a lot of yours seem to be attracting a lot of media attention, but we've had a lot of victories. So we're going to show a video from one of your cases, Hewitt Trussville High School in Alabama.
We come before you right now in desperation of your wisdom, strength, and divine stature. Lord, we all lift up every single player, coach, and facilitator throughout this entire game to play a true, honest, and competitive game to the peak of each individual's God-given potential. Father, today, we play as two separate teams, but we live as one body of Christ, as your hands and feet. Through it all, we will play and share our hearts out, ultimately to further your kingdom. Father, we thank you for every parent and student that contributed to the success of each program. And we ask tonight that all of us lean on your understanding, not our own. In Jesus' mighty name, we all pray. Amen.
So this is prayer over the loudspeaker at a public high school in Alabama. How was this reported to us, Chris?
So this was reported to us. Someone sent us in this video, which was posted on Facebook. They found it there, but they do go to that school. And what's interesting is the complainant in this case actually told us that the reason they knew to send it to us was that they'd heard about other cases, other loudspeaker cases, Lee County in particular, the one, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But they had heard we take care of these kind of violations, so they sent us the video. And as you saw in that video, there was a very sectarian prayer. It wasn't a simple, oh, we pray for the safety of our players. It was very, we are the hands and feet of Jesus. It was we all in your name, all of us, everybody here agrees with what I'm saying right now. Very coercive and very just trying to send a message that everyone here is Christian. This is a Christian event. And I wrote a letter to the superintendent about this one. We have received an interim response. Their attorney is talking with the school officials about it, but we do know that they did do this again. They did have another prayer over the loudspeaker this last Friday.
And that was the last game of the season, is that correct?
I'm not sure about that. It's got to be close if it's not the last game. This week's game was a little bit different. So that one was a very sectarian prayer, very long, included a lot of religious language. This week, all that they did was they said, we pray for the safety of our players, and then they led into what was already a stage sort of thing where the entire crowd did the Lord's Prayer. You had dozens of students had wore shirts that said stand up and pray, so they did sort of a whole spectacle that the school sponsored because the school allowed them to use the loudspeaker system and put aside time to allow this religious spectacle to take place. So the school was definitely involved in sending this message.
So this is an interesting point that you're making too about what happened after we sent a letter of complaint to a school district. It's something that Patrick and I have talked about, sort of knowing the script. So when somebody contacts FFRF about a legal complaint and we send a letter, and then the school district hasn't quite done it in this case yet, but does the right thing and stops the prayer, we typically see the same things happening over and over. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Patrick? What do we see when we make these types of complaints?
Right. And maybe this is useful for Chris to know, but I tell our students and parents, to some extent, there's going to be a weathering of the storm. People are very apt to oppose any change to tradition. So you can definitely expect people in the community, which they have the right to do, is to wear T-shirts and hold signs and to react. What we also expect and also try to prevent is kind of what happened here, whereas, we're just changing from the imposed prayer over the PA system to now we're going to announce the prayer, and then everybody collectively is going to say the Lord's Prayer, which to some extent is worse. Now you have everybody affirming and standing up and saying, the most sectarian prayer, a prayer coming from the Gospel of Matthew. So I think it's something that we expect in the script is that there's going to be a reaction. It's very rare that a complaint goes through and the school agrees and the community doesn't push back in some way. But what's interesting is, you read the headlines from Fox News or some of these sources and saying, how they've done such a clever thing. And the reality is they do this almost in every single instance, there's some pushback. And so we're aware of that. And I think it's something the schools have to make sure that they don't just evolve into continuing, to violate the law. That really they as happened here, this is a serious legal issue that they're still going to have to address.
Right. And what I've typically found is, they will sort of blow up and do their T-shirts and shout out the Lord's Prayer and, make a big spectacle of it. But then football season ends and the next fall, there's no prayer and nobody seems to miss it. So I think you're right. You have to weather the storm and realize that eventually it's all going to die down. And then the districts will comply with the law. It only happened in one case where that didn't happen for me, and that was Bell County, Kentucky. You may remember 2011, FFRF stopped prayer at Bell County High School in Kentucky. And they were doing prayer over the loudspeaker, and that held for 4 years until they got a new superintendent, and then the superintendent wanted to bring God back into the school district and started prayer again at that district. We're still looking for plaintiffs to sue that school district. So I want to move on to another complaint that Chris brought up, which is Lee County schools in Alabama. Very similar situation to the Trussville complaint. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, so in Lee County, after the first game of the year, we received a complaint that there was a prayer broadcast over the loudspeaker. I wrote a letter to the school superintendent. We got a letter back from their attorney saying that the superintendent talked to all the principals at the high schools and said that they're going to comply with the law, on football prayer, and that so loudspeaker prayer wouldn't be taking place. And exactly as Patrick said, and we've been discussing, the students immediately, there was just a very showy display. Other teams that would come visit, they all held hands in a circle around the football game and said the Lord's Prayer, just the students. Time wasn't set aside. This wasn't said over the loudspeaker, which of course makes it permissible. So that, yeah, exactly like Patrick was saying, they're doing this big show after the superintendent's done the right thing and ended the school sponsorship of the prayer. And hopefully next year they'll just forget about it and it'll go back to normal.
So that's a great victory that we received. And most of these complaints do result in victories because the law is so clear on these situations. So I want to move to a different state, Georgia. You received a complaint from Coweta High School in Georgia. Why don't you tell us about how we got that complaint, what happened there, and how it was resolved? So
in the Coweta, Georgia, we received a clip of a coach or a group of coaches praying with the team. It looks like they may have just been participating, not leading.
I think we actually have a clip.
Yeah,
that
we have the clip.
Show that.
So as you can see, there's a couple coaches, had just joined in with the prayer there. So this video was actually posted on a local sports news site that kind of covers high school football, is my understanding. Someone brought it to our attention, so I wrote a letter to the school district, who then pretty quickly got back to us. Their attorney said, we've reviewed this, we looked at it, our superintendent has told everyone this is going to stop. Their attorney actually put out a memo saying that coaches and volunteers cannot participate in student religious activities before, during, or after football games. So I think they really understood the issue and that they resolved the issue and that this won't be coming up or happening in this district again. I think they understood.
So we've talked a lot about Alabama and Georgia today. And I often get the questions, not just from journalists, but also from our members and other people who just find out what I do and are curious. They presume that most of the complaints we receive are from the South, from the Bible Belt. And when it involves football, obviously they're always said, oh, of course, football is religion down in the South. But is that really true? Are we getting most of our complaints from the South?
Well, I have sort of a biased source on that. As you know, I deal with Georgia and Alabama. So those are my states that I tend to deal with complaints with. So to me, it seems like there's more. But I know throughout our history, we've definitely dealt with complaints from all over the country. This is definitely a countrywide issue. In fact, one of the bigger cases that's happened in the past few years, Bremerton coach Joe Kennedy, who was praying, happened in Washington, I believe. So it's definitely not contained to the South,
right.
Though maybe those are maybe having more of a response, and so they might make the news a little bit more maybe. But certainly
right.
the violations aren't special to the South.
Definitely does seem to come from across the country. I handle the 6th Circuit for FFRF, and so I'm dealing with Tennessee and Kentucky, but also Michigan, and we do seem to get a lot of complaints out of Michigan on prayer issues as well. You handle the 4th Circuit, so it's kind of
right.
the Bible Belt as well.
Right. Well, and I mean, this is just interesting. I mean, I guess it depends on what you call the South, but there are some states where I think the school superintendents and the school systems are just doing a better job. So I get very few, now I'm going to regret saying this, but I get very few complaints from Virginia about some of their football prayer issues or similar issues. However, there's a lot of complaints coming out of North Carolina. And so these are two states that I'm dealing with that probably should be comparable in terms of the complaints we're getting. But the reality is certain places, the school systems just haven't put as much thought or even just monitoring in terms of complying with the Establishment Clause. Again, that's anecdotal on just me comparing two states, but I see it year after year that we get some complaints from similar states, and that may be because they're just not as proactive in making sure that they're complying with the law.
Right, and you bring up an interesting point too that I like to mention too, because a lot of times when we're dealing with the recalcitrant school districts who eventually do abide by the law, a lot of times we'll have the superintendents who will say publicly, like, I don't like this decision either, but we have to follow the law, and so we're going to do it. In fact, in Bell County, Kentucky, back in 2011, when I was working on that complaint, the superintendent posted a message onto the website talking about how they were a Christian community, and this was a long-standing tradition, but the law is the law, and we have to change. I often find, too, that some of the superintendents know what the law is, and they're just disregarding it until somebody brings it to their attention. Is that what you've...
Right. I mean, they've said that. I think, I don't remember what superintendent it was, but they've basically said, well, we knew we were going to get called out on this eventually. And so, I mean, this is something that we talk about at FFRF, and I think some of these school districts are going to be in for a rude awakening when the lawsuits start coming. I mean, I think it's come to the point where particularly with football prayer at high school events, that everybody should know. I mean, certainly it's been in the news because of Chris and because of our work, but they should know. And so if they're not complying, I mean, unfortunately, there's going to have to be some lawsuits over it, even though this is already settled by the Supreme Court. Our first response is usually to try to work with them to get it resolved. But I think there becomes a point where there are people who know what they're doing isn't right, but are just kind of waiting for it to be addressed by somebody else. Obviously, that would be a horrible means of running any government agency. We know we're violating the law. We'll just wait till trouble arises. Right. So it's a pretty poor decision making, I think, by some of these superintendents by not fixing it now if they can.
Right, and FFRF has been proactive in this issue area as well. We have also sent educational letters to superintendents from across the country on what is permissible and what's not with regard to prayer at events like graduations and football games. I want to change gears a little bit because as Patrick alluded to earlier, this isn't just in middle schools or high schools. This is also happening at all levels of education, and we see a lot of religion in college football programs. And that really came to light when you were working on a case out of Clemson, which is in South Carolina. Why don't you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Right. Well, first I'll just let everybody know Clemson is a public university in South Carolina. It's obviously had a very storied, at least in recent years, football program. Our complaint goes back to about 2014 when we were receiving reports about really just evangelical Christianity being implemented into the program. One of the things I did is just submitted a public records request to get a little bit more information about how they're running the program. And part of what we found out through that request and our research was, they really have a Christian chaplain that's a part of the football team. Really, he's basically treated like a coach. They do a church day event every year where the whole team gets on buses and goes to one of the local mega churches. They have devotionals with the team. They were doing prayers at team events. We also had, I think, famously one of their players was baptized on the football field. So there really was a lot going on here. We wrote to the school after reviewing the records and really just making an attempt to get some compliance because there's a number of players, presumably they're all not evangelical Christians on this team that are being impacted by what the school was doing.
Right. And so talk to me a little bit about the difference between what goes on in high school and what goes on in college. The courts have made a distinction between what is permissible with religion and religious activities, and why is that?
Right. Well, there's the two cases that came up in the college context where the courts really viewed the students as being more mature. They are adults, no longer minors. And there were two cases, I believe one in the Seventh Circuit and one in the Sixth Circuit, finding that basically a non-sectarian prayer, a generic prayer at a high school graduation was something that didn't violate the Establishment Clause, even though that same type of activity would be a problem, as the Supreme Court found at high schools. So that's one difference between them. The students are more mature. I think with the athletic programs, however, not a lot has fundamentally changed because, and this is what we pointed out to Clemson and other schools, players on a team are in a very coercive atmosphere. Coach controls their scholarship, controls their playing time, to some extent controls their, many aspects of their life, but even potentially aspects of their career, either as a reference or more appropriately if they are, good enough player to play at a professional level. So this is an environment where courts have viewed people to be coerced into religious practices. So there have been college cases where it was a coercive enough environment that it still would violate the Establishment Clause. Even though this is somebody who's over 18 years old, this is somebody who wants to do as the coach tells them. It's time to pray. They're going to pray. So there are some differences between college and high school, but in the athletic programs, it seems that there is still potential for a violation to be there.
Right. And like you said, any player is not going to want to risk alienating their coach who could potentially get them a career in the NFL. Right. So one of the things that FFRF did to talk about college religion in college football was an expose called the Pray to Play report. You worked extensively on that. Tell us a little bit about that and what that brought about and
Sure.
what we've done since.
Sure. Well, in 2015, Andrew Seidel and I, as well as Chris, helped on this report about religion in college football. And it was actually quite a big project in that we had to look at a number of universities that had basically chaplains, religious clergy inserted into their football programs. And so we looked at, I think, around 25 public universities that were known to have some form of a chaplaincy. And, we did further research into that, one of those being requesting extensive public records and looking through the records as to how it runs. Many of them, they use different names, but function in a similar way as Clemson, where they basically have an official coach as a member of the clergy who's doing chapel before games, usually the Friday before games, often for college players playing on Saturday. Also doing prayers before games, prayers after games. A lot of contact with students, almost being to some extent used for recruiting, which is one of the interesting things, which I think comes up with Clemson too, which is when these families visit, they often are pointing them to the chaplain to say, oh, we're not just a football team. We also will make sure your child is getting the right religion, which is obviously something a public
character.
Right. Obviously something a public school couldn't be doing when any other tour of the campus to decide where someone's going. So we basically published a report about the violations that's going on, the entanglement. One of the interesting aspects to this relates to the money. These guys are being paid. They're not always there for free. Some of the weird abuses that we saw, I think it was the Missouri chaplain at the University of Missouri, when they would go to the bowl games, so that the big college football bowl games, they would be flown out there. Well, in Missouri, not only did the school fly out the chaplain, they flew out the chaplain's wife, and then I think they had 4 or 6 of their children also being on the plane paid for by the university. And so this really was a little bit of a, shining some sunlight on this, saying, hey, be aware what these public universities are doing, and this is unconstitutional. These schools shouldn't be having this type of religious program.
And you guys also contacted the players themselves about their rights.
Right, that was something that, FFRF also wanting to be proactive. We were able to, many of these schools, basically we were able to email a number of players and just saying, hey, here's your rights as a player, and pointing out you don't have to participate in religion. You can complain to people in the university if you're being coerced into anything, any type of religious practice. And so it may be something we may never know fully what its impact will be. But we did speak with one player at a prominent football team who called and complained and said, I'm an atheist and I was bothered that I was expected to show up for chapel, and the chaplain was always interacting with players, and this player was even, as an atheist, was called upon by the head coach to say, oh, why don't you lead the prayer today? And complied, obviously, because the head coach is telling you to do something. So
right.
It is an interesting aspect to that. I think just given the demographics, there are a lot of non-religious players, and at some point, something's going to give here. Either the players are going to change things, or some players are probably going to, complain about religion being imposed on them when maybe a third or more of them aren't really religious at all.
Right, and the demographics are changing with the millennials being more non-religious than any other generation. I think it was wise for FFRF to let the players know what their rights are and that they don't necessarily have to comply. I think there was one NBA coach that recognized, hey, we're not all Christians, so I'm going to stop the prayer. And hopefully that will trickle down, like you mentioned earlier, to colleges and to high schools and to middle schools, where they realize that they have a more religiously diverse student body, and it's not appropriate anymore. I think it's time for us to take some questions from our viewers. Let me just check this out. So Phil Monroe asks, what is the current status on cheerleaders having religious banners for the team to run through?
Well, this is a bit of a complicated issue because there's been some very public disputes over this. One famously being in Kuntz ISD is a school district in Texas where FFRF, I think it was in 2012, all the way back to 2012, received a complaint about they're putting religious run-through banners that the players run through to start the football games. And this is something that's on the field, that's part of a school activity, and we said, hey, the school shouldn't be promoting this. This is the equivalent of a loudspeaker type religious pronouncement. And so that case is still ongoing in Texas because the cheerleaders turned around and sued, saying purely under Texas law, they were claiming that they had the right to put these religious messages on banners. So far, I think the Court of Appeals has ruled on parts of this case twice. It's now presumably going to either go back to the district court or either be appealed to the state Supreme Court. So it's unresolved in that aspect. But overall, I think the same principles apply. Regardless of what happens in Texas, I don't think Texas is a fair litmus test for how judges will rule throughout the country. And I think it does impact. Imagine being a person who wants to participate in cheerleading, and every week you're supposed to hold, if you're basically messages promoting Christ and Christianity. That's something that you're not going to be able to participate in. And this is a school extracurricular
right,
activity.
and a lot of times these situations aren't that, they are painting the banners and then facing them towards the players so the players can see them as they're running through and use that for their own religious purpose. They're facing the stands,
right.
And it is a very public pronouncement, much like the PA loudspeaker prayers, where it is for everybody and not just for the students themselves. Chris, have you taken any of these types of complaints this year?
Yeah, I had one fairly recently, and in that case, the banner they were using actually was like 20 feet tall and like had a cross on it, and relating back to what he said about coach, the thing is they try to portray this as like the cheerleaders are one group, and this is the cheerleaders' message, like they're sending a free speech message. It's like the thing, but it's a group of individuals. I mean, like you were saying, if there's an atheist cheerleader who's amongst these cheerleaders who has to put this message, it's like this isn't one message being given by the cheerleaders. It's not an individual message. Yeah, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And I do want to also point out that we have made complaints to other states outside of Texas as well about cheerleader banners, and we've received victories. We've had school districts in Mississippi and Alabama who have said, "Yep, these are not appropriate, and we're going to stop it."
And it's in the school's best interest to do that because, as this is school-sponsored speech, they want to be able to like control the message on these things.
Right.
Getting out of the religious sphere, if there was some political message, some profanity. I mean, if this is really student speech and they have a free speech right, they could put something really inappropriate on it. And I think schools don't want that. Schools don't want to see inappropriate messages on those banners.
Exactly. So here's another question. Someone named Michael asks, if both sides of the team are praying for their own team's victory, how do they think God is choosing sides? Can't they see how illogical that is in the first place?
Right. I mean, I think this is beyond, we're obviously dealing this from a legal standpoint, but just being a non-religious person, I think we can, I guess, I don't know, poke fun, but realize how insignificant it is as to who wins the football game. I've viewed some of the prayers, at least some of the college football prayers, that is what they're praying for. I mean, they're praying, of course, for health and safety, but they're praying for victory, really. And whoever prays harder is going to win the game is obviously an absurd proposition and a bizarre thing to bestow upon students that it's religion is dictating the outcome of this game rather than the players on the field and how they perform.
And I think every year when we get these types of complaints, we always think like, oh, we should check and see what their record is just to see, if it's working. But, I've never done that. I don't know if you guys have, but.
Because I've been reading about this Coweta, the school with the coach. I think they're 10-0 or something like that, or
so
maybe it's Trustville. One of the cases I'm dealing with, they have an undefeated season going on, so. Maybe it is doing something. I don't know.
But it's not working for the opposing teams.
No, definitely not.
So Cassidy asks, would you urge these schools to have a moment of silence instead? It's a great question, and one that comes up often as a proposed solution from school districts. What do you think about that?
There's no need for a moment of silence to start a football game or to really start any event. Really, that's I would say a cop-out to, hey, we still want religion in here, but at least it's better. I'll say it's better in that anybody on their own could privately say a prayer or a message that they'd want. I'm bothered by it because it's something that some states have implemented to start their school day, hoping that prayer will be instituted. But in reality, is they're taking 1 minute away from the school day every single day by having this moment of silence. Obviously, football games often start with solemnizing event already, that is the national anthem or some other announcement. There's no need to have a moment of silence. I would say it's obviously a lot better than having a prayer. So in that sense, it's better. But why include it at all, really?
Right. And usually when it comes up as a solution to the debate, it is being used as a placeholder for prayer so that people can shout the Lord's Prayer right before the game.
I was going to say it's kind of context specific because in some situations, where they've been having a prayer and now they go, oh, well, we'll just replace it with a moment of silence, like wink, like go ahead and do, they're trying to send the same message, but just trying to do it in a way they think might be permissible,
Right. Well, that looks like that's all of the questions that we have for today. As always, if you have a question about a state church issue, you can contact FFRF's legal department and we'll look into it for you. And I want to thank Patrick and Chris for being here with me today. And please tune in next week for our Ask an Atheist. Same time, same channel.